First of all, I want to thank all of you who wrote papers for this forum. I was reading through all of them the other day, and some really good papers, and it shows that we have an audience here that really understands the issues. Also, Claire, I want to give my personal thanks to you for being here. Thank you very much. Doug kind of set the stage for what we hope to do in these opening talks so that we can pull upon all of your expertise to come up with the recommendations as we go through the next 2 days. I'm going to start off with by asking you to imagine that we're in the year 2050. We just experienced another major coastal storm, and you can pick any city you want. New York, Boston, Charleston, New Orleans, Miami. Probably doesn't really make any difference. Houston. It may be nothing more than a 1% event, which is about what Sandy and Katrina were when they hit. Although this time around we might not quite be as lucky. It might not miss Miami like Andrew did. It might not decrease in magnitude just before it hits like Katrina did. It may hit Boston at high tide instead of at low tide. So it would have major significant events, impacts. Boston, you say, what about Boston? Well, in reality, had Hurricane Sandy hit Boston at high tide about 5.5 hours earlier, the city would have experienced that 100-year coastal storm, which would have flooded probably about 6% of its land area, including a lot of coastal neighborhoods. Once sea level rises 5 feet, which might happen by the end of the century, they'll experience those kinds of coastal 100-year storms about twice daily on high tide. So you can see we're talking about a changing hazard, a changing risk, and the need for adaptation in cities like Boston and all of our other major coastal cities. Oops, got to figure out the, here we go. This is not Venice, although it's the Venice of New Jersey. And this is the kind of thing that that we are going to see more and more of. For example, I just talked about Boston. Well, we're already seeing these high tide issues in Charleston, Norfolk, those sorts of places where the infrastructure, the roads, especially, we're seeing these impacts as we get these high tides that really impact what's going on. Douglas mentioned the 3 issues in this forum: hazards, risks, and ecosystems, and I'm going to talk just very briefly about each one so we're kind of all on the same page. Let's start with hazards. Well, hazards increase in our coastal areas by 2050 without question. Sea level rise alone is going to increase that hazard. Adding to that increase, of course, storm intensity and all the other things that climatologists are telling us will happen. In these highly urbanized areas, we've added the concern in many of our cities, for example, of subsidence. You can look at New Orleans and Houston as 2 easy examples, where the ground is sinking at the same time that the sea level is rising, and the risk and the hazard, of course, increase. So let's talk about risk. The risk is of course, absolutely increasing at the same time, because risk is the product of not only the probability it's going to flood, but the consequences when it does flood. Unfortunately, especially in the last 60, 70 years, we've been developing our coastlines with impunity. Of course, there's a huge demand for people who live on the coast, and there's a lot of people who have made a lot of money by developing and selling that land. The people that are living there now are the ones that are having to struggle with the consequences. There's 2 groups that are doing that. Those people living there. The other group is you and I, the ones paying a lot of the tab. The federal government, unfortunately, has in the last 50 years has changed from paying about 20% of the total disaster cost to now where we're paying almost 70% of the total disaster costs are being picked up by the federal taxpayer. So we have a number of, unfortunately, federal programs that support and encourage this continued at-risk development. About 38% of the U.S. population lives in coastal counties. Now, I'm pulling a couple of numbers from Kevin Colton's paper. And apparently, I think, Kevin, you must have done this as part of a study for FEMA about how many people live in coastal floodplains. Kevin's paper indicates that there are about 9 million people living in the 1% coastal floodplain and about 11 million people living in the 500-year, or 0.2%. I don't know if that's based on existing maps. We'll probably be talking about that with Kevin as we go along. So that may change if you deal with newer maps, too. And Kevin indicates that about 500,000 people were added to that 9 million in that 2000 to 2010 period. Maria Honeycutt at lunch today will be giving a demonstration of that coastal inundation and the impacts, therefore, of it. So you want to catch that this noon. Coastal flooding, besides the buildings, I talked a bit about infrastructure. We all know the story of New York City and the subways and the damage, the flooding costs of the subway system, and the fact that they had not completed adaptations yet for that. That same thing is true in Boston, where right now you're only 2.5 feet above sea level. So all these infrastructure issues are going to be huge. They continue to be huge. In terms of population, the U.S. can expect to add about 120 million people by 2050, and no reason to think that the trend of the half of them moving to the coast will continue also, or to coastal counties at least. So you put together the population explosion, the increased hazard, and the increased risk, and you can see that we've got a train wreck coming. We saw the precursor of that in the last couple of years between Katrina and Sandy. While all this has been going on, what's happening with our ecosystems? Well, we have a great history of well, we can screw up our ecosystems just about as fast as you can blink an eye these days. We did a lot of that, by the way, before we really understood what was going on. Here's for example, is New Jersey Barrier Island. Well, a lot of these barrier islands in the Northeast were developed before we understood how barrier islands worked and that this is Mother Nature's way of protecting the coast. Sandy said, this is the same barrier island in the same shot. You can see where Sandy said either there was an outlet there before and it recreated it, or it created a new one, and of course caused massive damage at the same time. These are difficult issues to struggle with when you've got already developed barrier islands. Coastal Barrier Resources Act was designed to stop federal money from being used to develop barrier islands. An audit of that program recently by GAO indicates that, I think it was GAO or the IG, I forget which, that that program really hasn't worked as well as we'd hoped it would work. There's a lot of development going on, and unfortunately, in some cases, some of that does have federal support. And that's what we've done a lot of, by the way. In the past, we've done a lot of engineering and hardening on our coastlines to protect existing development. Here's another New Jersey shot that shows you hardening during Sandy didn't really work. You know, it works up to a certain point and then you have failure. It's kind of like a levee. This hardening causes further deterioration and habitat loss as it prevents the inland migration of the entire ecosystem. Because the ecosystem gets caught, that whole system gets caught between sea level rise, the storm, and of course the hardening on the shore. So we're not allowing nature to do what nature really does. So our principal means of managing our coast over the century have got a couple of implications and focus that we have seen. We talk about who does the work and who's paid for it. Most of that work in the last half century has really been federal top-down structural work, paid for by the federal taxpayer, not necessarily by those who directly benefit from it. We continue to create tomorrow's disasters, as Dennis Milletti talked about many times, and as Gilbert did, and more costly development in high-risk areas. And of course, those people are the ones who say, give us disaster relief and protect us, help protect us too, asking the federal taxpayer to support that. We have a number of policies that help create some of those disasters. Some easy ones that we know about, we've talked about for years. We map yesterday's flood instead of tomorrow's flood. We use the 1% chance standard for highly urbanized areas and for structural protection, measures that we know are inadequate. We continue to view structures as a one-off protection, all or nothing. You got a 100-year structure, no other measures are necessary. We continue a disaster relief policy that rewards communities who do the least instead of rewarding those who do the most. That's kind of the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. And it's very difficult. You saw the debate that occurred over the $50 billion for Hurricane Sandy. That wasn't a very rational debate. It was a New Orleans, you got yours, I want mine kind of debate. That's not the time to change policy. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game when you're trying to pass a supplemental bill. That's not going to work. Between events is when we need to talk about changing policies so that the rules of the game are known and people understand that they're going to, what kind of consequences they're going to be responsible for. We may see a few successes in Sandy that we didn't see in Katrina, for example, but we may see some. Here, for example, are some elevated structures that survived Sandy. It showed you when they built property to B-zone standards, they did survive. These from John Miller in New Jersey. And now what's happening in terms of rebuilding safer? I think this famous slide has probably been the most, driven the most positive policy implications out of the Sandy event. This is a slide that shows you on the left that if your structure now is going to be 4 feet below the new base flood elevation, that 100-year 1%, on FEMA's advisory maps, the ABFEs, I'll use these acronyms, I'll try to describe them. Over 10 years, you're going to pay $95,000. If you're at that flood elevation 100-year, you'll pay 14, and if you're 3 feet above it, you'll pay 4. Well, take the difference between the two ends, and you've got $90,000 over a 10-year period difference. Well, that $90,000 will pay for elevation. So what happened? This happened because of bigger waters. The NFIP reform bill last summer that changed the actual rates in many of these structures. And I would submit that this is the reason Governor Christie said you're going to rebuild to the ABFEs. It's pretty simple to do the math here, because if he allows building right where they were, they're going to get hammered on flood insurance over the next 10 years. And the governor recognized that wasn't the smart thing to do, and it wouldn't make him look very, very good if he did that. So this bigger waters, by making rates actuarial, it's doing what we had hoped it was doing. It's driving mitigation. Very important. So you're seeing a lot of this happening. In New Jersey alone, there's probably 20,000 plus structures that were substantially damaged, more than 50% of their value. So now when they rebuild, they have to meet the new standards. So you've got this huge demand for structures, And their major mitigation element is going to be elevation. Huge demand. We really don't have the contractor force to do this. So far, we haven't had the contractor force to even determine how many substantially damaged structures there are. And we're 3 months after the event. These people, these are things that are key to making mitigation happen. People think mitigation doesn't happen quickly. You've got to know the rules of mitigation quickly, otherwise it's not going to happen in the long run. That's why it's just as important as the response part. That's what we've been trying to tell Congress. Let's talk a bit about disaster costs. You can add the taxpayer cost for Katrina and Sandy together and you're up over $200 billion. Huge amounts of money that the taxpayers are paying. I haven't even counted in the insured losses in the private sector, you know, the mental health costs, like suicide, depression, and the rest that are happening and that are still going on in places like New Orleans. This is 7 years after the event. A storm in this magnitude in 2050, of course, will be far beyond that. I'll talk a bit about what our national flood policy is. Well, let me show you what Gilbert said it was in 1939. By the way, this shows you can elevate about any size house these days. Gilbert said this is what our policy was in 1939. Protect the occupants of the floodplain against floods, aid them when they suffer flood losses, and then encourage more intensive use of the floodplain. Has it changed? Are we really doing anything different today? We need to talk about that. We need to come up with approaches where everybody wins. The community, the homeowner, the taxpayers, everybody all wins. Now, Gilbert was not about necessarily avoiding the floodplain, but let's talk about what you're going to come up with. I'm just going to throw a few ideas and principles out, you'll come up with a lot better ones than this in the next couple of days, but I'm just going to briefly throw some of these at you for ideas. Some basic principles. Those who live and develop at risk should pay for the risk. Hazard insurance is actuarial. I just showed you what happens when it is. We can drive the right behavior. If there's a need to subsidize insurance, you don't do it through insurance. Then it's no longer insurance. You use the social program, vouchers for low-income people. You use approaches like no adverse impact, where you quit worrying about how to build that one structure in the floodplain and worry about what all that development in the floodplain does to future flooding and future damages and future costs in that community. You mitigate those impacts before the development occurs. You don't stop the development, you just do it smart. And then finally, you utilize and integrate natural systems into managing coastal risk. So over the next day and a half, or 2 days, we'll be talking about that. I look forward to participating with you to do that. And I thank you for your attention.